Welcome to the Authority File. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. My guest, David Danelo, is the director of field research at the Foreign Policy Research Institute and an adjunct professor at the University of Texas at El Paso's National Security Studies Institute. He's a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy and served 7 years as an infantry officer in the Marine Corps. He's also an author, and his latest book is called The Field Researcher's Handbook, a guide to the art and science of professional fieldwork, published by Georgetown University Press. When he wrote the book, David Danelo relied on his experience in the military as well as his subsequent work with the U.S. Customs and Border Patrol to inform his approach to fieldwork. The result is a very approachable book that, at its heart, advocates for getting outside to conduct research. That may sound obvious, but it's easier than ever, after all, to conduct some kinds of research without ever leaving the office. David outlines the protocol for conducting field research, but he also delves into the art and science of it, too, which results in a title that helps explain the practice of field research for a broad range of readers. In this third episode of our 4-part series, David and I talk about how to be an effective interviewer and the surprising difficulty of interpreting the results of your own field research. So I think, you spend a good amount of time making the point that it's easier than ever to do quite a bit of research about a topic without ever really going into the field, but nevertheless experiencing research outside the confines of a classroom or a library or a lab and so on is invaluable. Describe some of the key differences between, doing research online versus field research. What would some of those be?
I think the easiest way to consider it is just to really go through your 5 senses.
Yeah.
If your sensory perspective, if you're Googling something, you're seeing it. At best, maybe you're hearing it. Maybe there's audio to something that you're interpreting. But it's a 2-dimensional picture. You're not smelling. You're not tasting. You're not sensing. You're not feeling. And that kinesthetic experience of understanding a problem set in the field is central to advancing knowledge in any body of work, and it's central to advancing dialogue in any body of work. We wouldn't have watched Anthony Bourdain if we didn't have a sense of what it meant to go somewhere and bring some type of knowledge back. I mean,
right.
It's probably the kind of patron saint of field research, right? It's we could go through any number of different professions of individuals who encounter another place and bring back knowledge of that they have only acquired through the physical experience of being there. And that's, I think, it goes back to the 80% of life is just showing up.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you could just take the travel industry, for example. I mean, sort of that quote unquote experiential aspect of travel now is so big, where you're not just kind of doing the touristy stuff. You're making a point of immersing yourself in the culture of wherever you are to sort of enhance the experience of the travel that you're doing. The way you structured the book, I mean, you start with sort of preparation for field research, then the actual field experience, and then you go into sort of the process of actually pulling the report together post, after being in the field. And one of the things I was a little surprised about in sort of that, in pulling the report together, you talk about how the experience a researcher has in the field when performing the research sometimes can kind of conspire to make the interpretation of the subsequent results more challenging than one might think. I'm wondering if you can kind of expand on that and talk a little bit about that sort of dynamic that happens.
Well, it kind of goes along with the irony of gaining new positionality, right? It's by virtue of having the experience of field research, you've now encountered something. You can walk away with more questions than answers because you've seen something in a new light. You've seen something through the lens of a different experience that you had not expected to encounter. And I think that the best way to handle that experience, because it's likely to occur. It's not an if, it's a when.
Right.
Because uh, simply by getting onto the ground and asking questions, you're going to end up in that category of unknown unknowns. You're going to find out things that you didn't know, which is what you're supposed to do.
Hmm.
But then you take that back to your original thesis, and then you wrestle with that a little bit, and then you say, okay, well, um, how did this change my bias and positionality? And I think my own view on this as a researcher is that part of doing good research is stating that up front. It's just candidly stating, hey, when I started, I thought X, and now that I've engaged the problem set, I think Y.
Yeah.
And here are the experiences that I've had that account for my change, my delta here. And here are the experiences that I haven't had.
Hmm.
So that's also, I think, an important, and that's emphasized in the book as well. Is it's just as important to say what you haven't had a chance to encounter as what you have. If somebody spends 3 years doing field work on something, they're going to see a lot more than someone who spent 3 weeks doing field work on it, or 3 days.
Hmm.
And so you might be able to get a lot on the ground for what you need to do for your organization or for your particular project in 3 days. But if you're attempting to scale to whatever it is that the deliverable is, whether it's a thesis or a dissertation, or some type of report for a company, or a piece of policy advice for a government, well, you need to be able to kind of disclose your limitations up front. It's kind of like the seller's disclosure on real estate. Like
Right.
this is what's going on with this piece of property that is the research that I've done.
Okay.
That's, I think, one way to look at it.
So you're literally incorporating those observations, like say, into the executive summary, so to speak, I guess, into the report itself as part of
Yeah,
the, yeah.
it could be. I mean, it could be beneficial in an executive summary, depending on how much what you haven't seen affects your conclusions. It could be an
Yeah.
annex, it could be something like, but it's just basically you could kind of roll it up as part of your research methodology. So
Right.
some people actually have a section of research methodology, and then that's where you would just put that out up front. Here's what I did. Here's the type of interviews I did. Here's the type of things that I didn't do. And sometimes it's beneficial when presenting your work to be able to say it. So.
You just heard from David Danelo, author of a new book published by Georgetown University Press called The Field Researcher's Handbook, a guide to the art and science of professional fieldwork. David is the director of field research for the Foreign Policy Research Institute and an adjunct professor at the University of Texas at El Paso's National Security Studies Institute. Join us next week for our final episode of this series, when David and I continue our conversation and talk about some of the key takeaways from his book about how to actually write and effectively present a field research report, and how David has ended up making a very personal connection to fieldwork.
It's more than just sales, because story is often truncated into, well, you tell the story of this, and then we're just trying to sell stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Well, no, I mean, story is about relating change, and so when we're talking about the experience of field research, we're talking about the experience of change. We're talking about the experience of how going into the field changes our perspectives on something that we didn't know before.
Right.
So when we're relating that information to a group of people who haven't had the experience that we've had, we're telling a story about it.
If you like what you hear, rate us or give us a review on your podcast platform of choice, and if there's a topic you'd like us to cover, drop me a line. I'm at bmickey@ala-choice.org. As always, sponsorship and advertising for the Authority File podcast are handled by Choice's advertising manager, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced by Choice's digital media specialist, Mark Dirks, and digital media assistant, Sabrina Kofer. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.